The airport was alive with energy, a sea of people rushing to their gates, dragging suitcases behind them, and clutching boarding passes tightly in their hands. It was late evening, and the hum of conversations mixed with the occasional announcement over the intercom created a chaotic yet familiar atmosphere. Among the crowd stood Daniel Carter, a tall man with short brown hair and a slightly worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't dressed like the typical businessman who frequented these flights. His jeans were faded, his sneakers scuffed, and his hoodie looked like it had seen better days. But none of that mattered to him. All he wanted was to get on the plane, settle into his seat, and enjoy the quiet hours of the flight ahead. Daniel had been traveling a lot lately, mostly for work. But this trip was different. He was heading to Los Angeles for an important meeting that could potentially change the course of his company's future. Though he didn't show it, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The last thing he needed was any kind of disruption or delay. Unfortunately, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. After finally making his way through security and grabbing a quick coffee from a nearby kiosk, Daniel arrived at Gate 27. The line to board the plane was already forming, so he joined the queue, taking out his book to pass the time. As the minutes ticked by, the line moved steadily forward until it was his turn to hand over his boarding pass. The gate agent scanned it quickly, gave him a polite nod, and waved him through. Relieved to be done with the formalities, Daniel stepped onto the jet bridge and entered the aircraft. The interior of the plane was dimly lit, with passengers shuffling around, stowing their bags in the overhead compartments, and settling into their seats. Daniel found his assigned spot, a window seat near the middle of the plane, and slid into it with a sigh of relief. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him, adjusted his hoodie, and opened his book. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The hum of voices filled the cabin as more passengers boarded, and the flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, ensuring everyone was ready for takeoff. But then, something changed. An announcement came over the intercom, cutting through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience, but there will be a brief delay before departure. Please remain seated while we address a minor issue." The tone of the voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but it sent a ripple of curiosity through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, wondering what the minor issue could be. Some shrugged it off, assuming it was just another routine hiccup. Others leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering theories about mechanical problems or weather delays. Daniel barely paid attention. He kept his eyes on his book, trying to block out the growing murmur around him. But within moments, 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the front of the plane. They scanned the rows of passengers, their expressions unreadable. Then, without warning, they began walking down the aisle toward Daniel's section. At first, Daniel didn't think much of it. His mind was still focused on the pages of his book, the words pulling him deeper into the story. But as the officers drew closer, he noticed the way they were looking at him, or rather staring directly at him. Their gaze was intense, unwavering, and it made his stomach tighten with unease. When they stopped beside his row, one of them leaned down slightly and said, "Sir, we need you to come with us." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "What, why?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "We'll explain once we're off the plane," the officer replied curtly, gesturing for him to stand up. For a second, Daniel considered refusing. This had to be some kind of mistake. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just sitting there, minding his own business, reading his book. But the firmness in the officer's tone left little room for argument. Reluctantly, Daniel closed his book, slipped it into his backpack, and stood up. As he followed the officers down the aisle, he couldn't help but notice the stares of the other passengers. Some looked concerned, others curious, and a few even seemed suspicious. It was as if they already believed he was guilty of something, whatever that something might be. Once outside the plane, the officers led Daniel to a small waiting area near the gate. One of them pulled out a clipboard and began asking questions. "Can you tell us your name, sir?" "Daniel Carter," he answered, his voice steady despite the knot of frustration building inside him. "Look, I don't understand what's going on here. Why was I taken off the plane? The officer hesitated, glancing briefly at his partner before responding. We received a report from another passenger who expressed concern about your behavior. They mentioned you were acting suspiciously. Suspiciously, Daniel repeated, incredulous. I was sitting in my seat reading a book, that's it. How is that suspicious? The officer shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. We're just following protocol, sir. These kinds of reports require us to investigate further. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This was unbelievable. Suspicious behavior? Based on what? His clothes? His backpack? The fact that he wasn't dressed like everyone else on the plane? None of it made sense. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. While the questioning continued, Daniel's mind raced. He thought about the meeting he was supposed to attend in Los Angeles and how critical it was for his company. Every minute wasted here was another step backward. And for what? Because someone decided he didn't look the part? It was infuriating. As the minutes dragged on, Daniel overheard fragments of conversation between the officers and the airline staff. Apparently, the complaint had come from a fellow passenger, a man who had described Daniel as out of place and potentially dangerous. The absurdity of it all hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Dangerous? Him? A man who spent most of his days buried in spreadsheets and conference calls? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the questioning ended. The officers informed Daniel that he was free to go, though they advised him to contact the airline if he wanted to rebook his flight. Free to go, but not back onto the plane. Not tonight. Defeated and fuming, Daniel walked away from the gate, his thoughts swirling with anger and disbelief. Little did anyone know the real trouble was only beginning, for the airline, for the crew, and especially for the person who had made the complaint. Because Daniel Carter wasn't just any traveler, and once the truth came out, everything would change. Daniel stood near the gate, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. The anger bubbling inside him was hard to ignore, but he tried to focus on calming down. He glanced at the digital clock on the wall, 8:47 p.m., and sighed heavily. His flight was long gone, and so was his chance to make it to Los Angeles in time for the meeting that could shape the future of his company. He felt stuck, frustrated, and powerless. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. After a few rings, Karen, his assistant, picked up. "Hey, Daniel," she said cheerfully. "How's the flight?" "It's not happening," Daniel replied, his tone clipped. "I got kicked off the plane." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, kicked off?" Karen asked, her voice suddenly sharp with concern. Daniel explained everything, the complaint, the security officers, the questioning, and how he was left standing in the terminal like some kind of criminal. As he spoke, Karen listened intently, her mind racing. When he finished, she let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's insane. Did they even give you a reason?" "They said someone thought I looked suspicious," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "Suspicious because I wasn't wearing a suit or carrying a fancy briefcase, I guess." Karen didn't respond right away. Instead, she asked, "Do they have any idea who you are?" Daniel frowned. "What does that matter? I'm just a guy trying to catch a flight." "Exactly," Karen shot back. "But maybe they need a reminder." Her tone softened slightly. "Look, I'll handle this. Stay where you are. Don't book another flight yet. Let me talk to the airline first." Before Daniel could protest, Karen hung up. He stared at his phone for a moment, unsure whether to feel relieved or annoyed. On one hand, it was nice to have someone take charge of the situation. On the other hand, he hated feeling like he needed someone else to fix things for him. Still, he trusted Karen. She had been by his side since the early days of his company, and if anyone could smooth things over, it was her. Back at the gate, the airline staff was already scrambling. Word had spread quickly among the crew about the man who had been removed from the flight. At first, no one paid much attention. It wasn't uncommon for passengers to be asked to leave due to complaints or policy violations. But something about this case felt different. For one thing, the man hadn't caused any trouble. He hadn't argued loudly, refused to follow instructions, or done anything remotely disruptive. In fact, according to the flight attendants who had observed him briefly, he had seemed completely harmless. Then came the call from Innovatech Industries, or rather from Karen, who wasted no time getting to the point. "Hi, my name is Karen Miller and I'm calling on behalf of Daniel Carter," she began, her voice firm but polite. "He was a passenger on your flight tonight and I understand there was an issue. Could you please explain what happened?" The customer service representative on the other end hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't discuss specific incidents involving passengers without proper authorization." Karen smiled to herself. This was exactly the reaction she'd expected. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Let me clarify. Mr. Carter is the CEO of Innovatech Industries. Perhaps you've heard of us? We're responsible for developing several technologies that your company uses in its operations." The representative froze. Innovatech Industries wasn't just any company. It was a global leader in smart technology with partnerships spanning multiple industries, including aviation. If Karen was telling the truth and she sounded credible enough, then the airline might have just alienated one of its most valuable clients. "I'll need to verify this information," the representative stammered, clearly flustered. "Could you hold for a moment?" "No problem," Karen replied, leaning back in her chair. She knew she had them now. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Daniel decided to grab a cup of coffee while he waited. The cafe near the gate was crowded, but he managed to find a spot at the counter. As he sipped his drink, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from the nearby tables. Some passengers were still talking about the incident, speculating about why the man had been removed. A few mentioned the word security, while others whispered about terrorism. It made Daniel's blood boil. They didn't know anything about him, yet they were quick to judge based on appearances. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was Karen. "Okay, here's the deal," she said as soon as he answered. "They're verifying your identity now, but I think we've got their attention. How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Daniel admitted. "This whole thing feels ridiculous." "I know," Karen said sympathetically. "But listen, once they realize who you are, they're going to bend over backward to make this right. Trust me." Sure enough, within minutes, the airline staff received confirmation of Daniel's identity. The news sent shockwaves through the team. The captain of the flight immediately contacted the ground crew, demanding answers. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" he demanded. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" One of the gate agents stammered, We didn't know, sir. No one told us." "Well, find him," the captain ordered, "and bring him back here. Now." The staff sprang into action, searching the terminal for Daniel. They found him sitting alone at a table, nursing his coffee. One of the supervisors approached cautiously, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. "Mr. Carter?" she said tentatively. Daniel looked up, his face unreadable. "Yes?" The supervisor swallowed nervously. "I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. There's been a misunderstanding, and we'd like to invite you back onto the flight, if you're willing, of course." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? Is that what you're calling it?" The supervisor winced. "I understand how frustrating this must be for you, and I assure you we're taking steps to ensure it doesn't happen again. Please, let us make this right." For a moment, Daniel considered refusing. Part of him wanted to walk away and never look back. But then he thought about the meeting in Los Angeles and how much was riding on it. He couldn't afford to miss it, not because of someone else's mistake. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but I want assurances that this won't happen again." "You have my word," the supervisor promised. "We'll do everything we can to make your experience as smooth as possible." With that, Daniel stood up and followed the supervisor back to the gate. Along the way, he noticed the change in the staff's demeanor. Where before they had treated him with suspicion, now they greeted him with nervous smiles and overly polite gestures. It was strange, almost surreal, but Daniel chose not to dwell on it. He had bigger things to worry about. As he boarded the plane a second time, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The flight attendants greeted him warmly, apologizing profusely for the earlier incident. One of them even offered to upgrade him to first class, but Daniel declined. He just wanted to sit down, finish his book, and put the whole ordeal behind him. For now, at least. Little did he know, the ripple effects of this incident were only beginning to unfold. Back at the gate, the airline staff held an emergency meeting to discuss what had happened and how to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Meanwhile, Daniel's story was already spreading among the passengers on the flight, sparking conversations about fairness, bias, and the importance of treating everyone with respect. By the time the plane finally took off, Daniel felt a small sense of relief, but also a lingering frustration. The incident had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just about being judged unfairly. It was about realizing how easily people could jump to conclusions based on superficial details. And as he gazed out the window at the darkening sky, he resolved to use this experience to spark meaningful change, not just for himself, but for others who might face similar situations in the future. The plane was quiet as Daniel settled back into his seat, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. He leaned his head against the window and stared out at the clouds below, trying to shake off the lingering frustration from earlier. Despite the apologies and promises from the airline staff, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. Being judged so harshly based on appearances had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and no amount of first-class upgrades or polite words could erase that feeling. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles handing out snacks and drinks, one of them stopped beside Daniel. Her name tag read Linda, and she gave him a hesitant smile. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Carter?" she asked softly. "We're really sorry for what happened earlier." Daniel glanced up at her, noting the sincerity in her voice. "I'm fine, thanks," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. He wasn't ready to forgive just yet, not when the memory of being escorted off the plane still burned fresh in his mind. Linda nodded quickly, clearly sensing his mood. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, please let us know." She lingered for a moment longer before moving on, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. Despite his efforts to focus on the view outside, Daniel found himself replaying the events of the night over and over again, the way the passenger had labeled him suspicious, the security officer's stern expressions, the whispers of the other travelers. It all felt surreal now, like something out of a bad movie. But it wasn't fiction. It was real. And it had happened, to him. What bothered him most was how easily assumptions had been made without any evidence. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet he'd been treated like a threat simply because he didn't fit someone's idea of what a normal passenger should look like. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Karen, calling again. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the passengers around him. "How's it going?" Karen asked immediately. "Did they sort things out?" "They apologized and let me back on the plane," Daniel replied, rubbing his temples. "But honestly, Karen, none of this feels right. I shouldn't have been kicked off in the first place." "I know," Karen said firmly. "And trust me, we're going to address this properly once you land. But for now, just focus on getting to LA and handling your meeting. Everything else can wait." Daniel sighed. "You're probably right. Thanks for stepping in earlier, by the way. I don't think I would have gotten back on the plane if you hadn't called." "No problem," Karen said warmly. "That's what I'm here for. Now try to relax, okay? You've got a big day ahead of you tomorrow." After hanging up, Daniel leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Relaxing was easier said than done, though. Every time he thought about the incident, his chest tightened with anger and disappointment. Still, he knew Karen was right. He needed to focus on the task at hand. The meeting in Los Angeles was too important to let anything distract him. Meanwhile, the crew on board was doing everything they could to make amends. Linda and the other flight attendants kept checking on Daniel discreetly, offering refills on his water and ensuring he had everything he needed. Even the captain came out of the cockpit during the flight to personally apologize. Mr. Carter, he began, his tone respectful, I want to express my deepest regrets for what occurred earlier. We pride ourselves on providing excellent service to all our passengers, and tonight we clearly fell short of that standard. Daniel looked at him, surprised by the visit, but unwilling to let his guard down completely. Thank you for saying that, he said evenly. But I hope you understand why this was such a frustrating experience for me. Absolutely, the captain replied earnestly. Believe me, we're taking this very seriously. Once we land, we'll review the situation thoroughly to ensure nothing like this happens again. Daniel nodded slowly, appreciating the effort even if he wasn't fully convinced. I appreciate that, he said, but actions speak louder than words. The captain agreed wholeheartedly. Of course, you have my word that we'll do better. Back in the galley, the flight attendants were discussing the situation in hushed tones. None of them had expected the man they'd removed from the plane to turn out to be someone so influential. They felt embarrassed and guilty, knowing they had played a part in the ordeal. Linda, who had spoken to Daniel multiple times since he returned, voiced what everyone else was thinking. We messed up big time, she admitted. He's been nothing but calm and polite, even though we treated him horribly. Another flight attendant, a younger woman named Sarah, nodded solemnly. Yeah, and the worst part is it all started because of some random complaint. We didn't even stop to question it, we just acted. It's a wake-up call for all of us, Linda said firmly. We need to be better about listening to people and not jumping to conclusions. Their conversation was interrupted by the intercom crackling to life. The captain announced that they would begin their descent into Los Angeles soon and thanked the passengers for flying with them. As the seatbelt sign lit up, Daniel fastened his belt and prepared for landing. The city, lights shimmered below, stretching endlessly across the horizon. For a brief moment, the beauty of the view distracted him from his frustrations. When the plane finally touched down, the atmosphere on board shifted noticeably. Passengers gathered their belongings and began filing out of the aircraft, chatting amiably as they went. But Daniel noticed something unusual. Several of the passengers who had witnessed the earlier commotion approached him as they exited the plane. One man, an older gentleman with silver hair, stopped beside Daniel and extended his hand. Sir, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened to you earlier, he said sincerely. It was wrong, and I hope you're able to move past it. Daniel shook his hand, surprised by the gesture. Thank you, he said simply. That means a lot. A young woman followed suit, adding her own apology. I didn't say anything at the time, but I wish I had spoken up. I'm really sorry. More passengers expressed their regret. Daniel felt a small sense of vindication. While the apologies didn't undo the harm caused, they showed that others recognized the injustice of what had happened. It was a reminder that not everyone was quick to judge based on appearances. Once off the plane, Daniel was greeted by a representative from the airline waiting near the gate. She introduced herself as Michelle and handed him a handwritten note along with a voucher for future travel. This is from our CEO, she explained. He wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience and assure you that we're committed to making improvements. Daniel accepted the items silently, tucking them into his backpack. He appreciated the gesture, but he knew true change would require more than notes and vouchers. Still, he thanked Michelle politely before making his way toward baggage claim. By the time he reached the terminal, Daniel's phone was buzzing nonstop with messages and emails. Word of the incident had spread quickly, thanks in part to social media posts from fellow passengers who had witnessed the drama unfold. Journalists and bloggers were already reaching out, eager to hear his side of the story. For now, Daniel ignored the notifications. He had a meeting to prepare for, and that took priority. As he climbed into the private car arranged by the airline, Daniel reflected on the whirlwind of emotions he'd experienced over the past few hours. Anger, frustration, embarrassment, they had all come crashing down on him in waves. But amid the chaos, there had also been moments of clarity. The incident had exposed a deeper issue, one that went beyond airlines and travel policies. It was about biases, assumptions, and the way people are often judged before they're truly understood. For Daniel, the experience was both infuriating and eye-opening. And as the car sped toward downtown Los Angeles, he resolved to use his platform to shine a light on these issues, not just for himself but for anyone who might find themselves unfairly judged in the future. The car ride from the airport to Daniel's hotel was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of his phone as new notifications poured in. Daniel stared out the window, watching the city lights blur together as they sped down the freeway. Los Angeles was alive with energy, its streets bustling even at this late hour. But Daniel wasn't paying much attention to the scenery. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the night and thinking about what he should do next. When the car finally pulled up to the sleek modern hotel where Daniel was staying, a valet rushed to open the door for him. The representative from the airline, Michelle, had arranged everything: his room, transportation, and even a complimentary upgrade to a suite. It was a nice gesture, but Daniel couldn't help feeling that it was too little, too late. He thanked the driver curtly, grabbed his backpack, and headed inside. At the front desk, the clerk greeted him warmly and handed over his keycard. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," she said with a polite smile. "If there's anything you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to let us know." "Thanks," Daniel replied, forcing a small smile before heading to the elevator. Once in his room, he dropped his bag on the floor and flopped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but sleep felt impossible. Too many thoughts were swirling around in his head. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the flood of messages. Most were from colleagues and friends checking in after hearing about the incident. A few were from reporters asking for interviews. One email stood out, a message from Karen, who had clearly been busy while he was on the flight. "Daniel," the email read, "I've already started drafting a statement for you. We can release it tomorrow after your meeting. In the meantime, try to get some rest. You've got a big day ahead of you." Daniel sighed and set the phone aside. As much as he wanted to dive into addressing the situation, he knew Karen was right. He needed to focus on the meeting first. His company's future depended on it. The next morning, Daniel woke up early, feeling groggy but determined. After showering and changing into a fresh outfit, a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, he headed downstairs for breakfast. The hotel restaurant was nearly empty, which suited him just fine. He ordered coffee and a light meal, sitting by the window as he reviewed his notes for the meeting. By mid-morning, he was seated in a sleek conference room at the offices of a major tech firm. Across the table sat a group of executives, their expressions serious as they listened to Daniel outline his proposal. For 2 hours, he spoke passionately about his company's innovations and how they could benefit their partnership. Despite the lingering tension from the previous night, Daniel gave the presentation his all, channeling his frustration into focus. When the meeting ended, the executives exchanged glances before nodding approvingly. "We're impressed, Mr. Carter," one of them said. "Your vision aligns perfectly with our goals. Let's move forward with the next steps." Relief washed over Daniel as he shook hands with the team. The meeting had gone better than he'd hoped, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small sense of accomplishment. But as soon as he stepped outside the building, reality came rushing back. Reporters were waiting for him, cameras flashing as they shouted questions about the incident on the plane. "Mr. Carter, is it true you were removed from a flight due to a passenger complaint? How do you feel about the way the airline handled the situation? Do you plan to take legal action?" Daniel held up a hand, signaling for silence. "I'll address everything in a formal statement later today," he said firmly. "For now, I'd appreciate some privacy." The reporters reluctantly backed off, though a few continued snapping photos as he climbed into a waiting car. Back at the hotel, Daniel met with Karen via video call to finalize the statement. Together, they crafted a message that was both professional and heartfelt, calling attention to the broader issue of bias and discrimination in public spaces. "We live in a world where appearances often dictate how people are treated," the statement read. "But assumptions based on clothing or behavior are not only unfair, they're harmful. What happened to me last night is a reminder that we must do better. Airlines, businesses, and individuals all have a responsibility to treat others with dignity and respect, regardless of outward appearances. Once the statement was ready, Karen shared it with the media. Within minutes, it began circulating online, sparking widespread discussion. Social media platforms lit up with reactions, ranging from outrage over Daniel's treatment to praise for his willingness to speak out. Many people shared their own stories of being unfairly judged, turning the conversation into a larger movement about equality and fairness. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to respond. Their CEO issued a public apology, acknowledging the mistake, and outlining plans to implement new training programs for staff. They also announced a partnership with an organization focused on combating bias and discrimination in travel. While some critics dismissed these efforts as superficial, others saw them as a step in the right direction. Back at the hotel, Daniel watched the news coverage unfold, alternating between satisfaction and frustration. On one hand, he was glad. The story had sparked meaningful dialogue. On the other hand, he knew change wouldn't happen overnight. Bias was deeply ingrained in society, and addressing it would require sustained effort from everyone, not just airlines or corporations. That evening, Daniel received a call from an unexpected source, the passenger who had filed the complaint. The man introduced himself nervously, explaining that he hadn't realized the impact of his actions until reading Daniel's statement. "I'm truly sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I made a snap judgment without knowing anything about you, and I regret it deeply." Daniel listened silently, weighing his response. Part of him wanted to lash out, to hold the man accountable for the chaos he'd caused. But another part of him understood that everyone makes mistakes, and that growth comes from learning. "Thank you for reaching out," Daniel said finally. "I hope this experience helps you think twice before making assumptions about someone in the future." After hanging up, Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, forgiveness, exhaustion, they all swirled together, leaving him drained. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights once more. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to imagine a future where situations like this were less common. It wouldn't be easy, but if his story could inspire even a small shift in perspective, it would be worth it. As the night wore on, Daniel turned off his phone and closed the curtains, shutting out the noise of the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now he found solace in the quiet. Change was possible, it always was. And for Daniel, that knowledge was enough to keep moving forward. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for Daniel. His statement had gone viral, sparking conversations across social media, news outlets, and even talk shows. People from all walks of life chimed in, sharing their thoughts and personal experiences. Some praised Daniel for speaking out about bias and discrimination, while others criticized him for making too big a deal out of what they saw as a one-time mistake. Despite the mixed reactions, Daniel knew he had struck a nerve, and that was exactly what he wanted. In the weeks after the flight, Daniel threw himself into work, determined to stay focused on his company's goals, but he couldn't ignore the growing momentum of the movement his story had inspired. Journalists reached out daily, asking for interviews or comments. Activists invited him to speak at events about equality and fairness in public spaces. Even airlines and other businesses began reaching out, seeking advice on how to address bias within their own operations. At first, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to become the face of such a complex issue. After all, he was just a man who'd been unfairly judged because of his appearance. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had a unique opportunity to make a difference. If his experience could shine a light on a problem that affected so many people, then stepping into that role was worth it. Karen noticed the shift in Daniel's attitude almost immediately. "You seem different," she said one afternoon during a meeting. "Like you've found your purpose." Daniel chuckled softly. "Maybe I have," he admitted. "This whole thing has made me realize how much work still needs to be done. And if I can help push things forward, even a little bit, then why not?" With Karen's support, Daniel began organizing his efforts. He started by partnering with organizations dedicated to combating bias and promoting inclusivity. Together, they developed workshops and training programs designed to teach people how to recognize and overcome their own assumptions. The airline responsible for the incident also joined forces with Daniel, eager to show they were serious about change. They incorporated his feedback into their new policies, ensuring employees received better guidance on handling complaints and interacting with passengers fairly. Daniel's involvement didn't stop there. He agreed to give interviews and write articles, using his platform to keep the conversation going. In one particularly candid interview, he shared how vulnerable he'd felt during the incident. "It's easy to say we should treat everyone equally," he told the interviewer. "But actually doing it, that's the hard part. It takes awareness, effort, and sometimes even courage. We need to challenge ourselves to see beyond appearances and give people the benefit of the doubt." His words resonated deeply with audiences. Countless viewers and readers reached out to thank him for putting the issue into perspective. Many admitted they hadn't thought much about unconscious bias before, but now found themselves questioning their own behaviors. Parents wrote letters, saying they planned to teach their children about fairness and respect. Teachers shared stories of incorporating discussions about bias into their classrooms. Slowly but surely, Daniel's voice was making an impact. As the months passed, Daniel traveled around the country, speaking at conferences and community events. He met people from all backgrounds, each with their own stories of being misjudged or mistreated. A young woman recounted how she'd been denied service at a restaurant because of her tattoos. An elderly man described being followed through a store simply because of his race. A teenager explained how teachers often underestimated his abilities because of where he lived. Each story reinforced Daniel's belief that bias was everywhere, and that fighting it required collective action. Despite the progress, Daniel faced criticism too. Some accused him of exaggerating the incident for attention. Others argued that focusing on individual cases wouldn't solve systemic problems. While the negativity stung, Daniel refused to let it discourage him. Instead, he used it as motivation to keep pushing forward. "Change is never easy," he told Karen during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "If everyone agreed, we wouldn't need to fight for it." One of the most rewarding moments came when Daniel returned to Los Angeles for a follow-up meeting with the tech firm he'd partnered with earlier. This time, the executives greeted him warmly, congratulating him on his advocacy work. "You've inspired us to take a closer look at our own practices," one of them said. "We're implementing new diversity initiatives and working to create a more inclusive environment." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't expected. "That's amazing to hear," he replied. "Real change starts when companies like yours step up and lead by example." By the end of the year, Daniel's efforts had gained significant traction. Airlines introduced stricter guidelines for handling passenger complaints, emphasizing fairness and transparency. Schools incorporated lessons on bias and empathy into their curriculums. Businesses invested in diversity training programs, recognizing the value of inclusivity in the workplace. None of these changes were perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but they were steps in the right direction. On a personal level, the experience transformed Daniel in ways he hadn't anticipated. He became more patient, more empathetic, and more aware of the power of his words and actions. He also learned to forgive, not just the passenger who complained about him, but himself for letting the incident shake his confidence. Life, he realized, was full of challenges, and resilience was key to overcoming them. One evening, as Daniel sat on the balcony of his home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he reflected on everything that had happened. What started as a frustrating and humiliating ordeal had turned into something far greater, an opportunity to inspire change and connect with others. He thought about the people he'd met along the way, the stories they'd shared, and the hope they'd given him for the future. Karen called later that night, her voice filled with excitement. "Did you see the latest numbers?" she asked. "Your workshops have reached thousands of people already, and the feedback has been incredible." Daniel grinned, leaning back in his chair. "That's great to hear," he said. "But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's willing to listen, learn, and grow." "You're right," Karen said warmly. "Still, None of this would have happened without you. Daniel thought about that for a moment. While he didn't consider himself a hero, he understood the importance of taking a stand even when it was uncomfortable. Sometimes the smallest actions could spark the biggest changes. And as he hung up the phone and gazed at the stars above, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the chance to make a difference. Life, Daniel realized, was unpredictable. Challenges would always arise, and not every battle would be won. But as long as people kept striving for fairness, kindness, and understanding, the world would inch closer to becoming a better place, one step at a time. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for Daniel. His statement had gone viral, sparking conversations across social media, news outlets, and even talk shows. People from all walks of life chimed in, sharing their thoughts and personal experiences. Some praised Daniel for speaking out about bias and discrimination, while others criticized him for making too big a deal out of what they saw as a one-time mistake. Despite the mixed reactions, Daniel knew he had struck a nerve, and that was exactly what he wanted. In the weeks after the flight, Daniel threw himself into work, determined to stay focused on his company's goals. But he couldn't ignore the growing momentum of the movement his story had inspired. Journalists reached out daily, asking for interviews or comments. Activists invited him to speak at events about equality and fairness in public spaces. Even airlines and other businesses began reaching out, seeking advice on how to address bias within their own operations. At first, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to become the face of such a complex issue. After all, he was just a man who'd been unfairly judged because of his appearance. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had a unique opportunity to make a difference. If his experience could shine a light on a problem that affected so many people, then stepping into that role was worth it. Karen noticed the shift in Daniel's attitude almost immediately. "You seem different," she said one afternoon during a meeting. "Like you've found your purpose." Daniel chuckled softly. "Maybe I have," he admitted. "This whole thing has made me realize how much work still needs to be done. And if I can help push things forward, even a little bit, then why not?" With Karen's support, Daniel began organizing his efforts. He started by partnering with organizations dedicated to combating bias and promoting inclusivity. Together, they developed workshops and training programs designed to teach people how to recognize and overcome their own assumptions. The airline responsible for the incident also joined forces with Daniel, eager to show they were serious about change. They incorporated his feedback into their new policies, ensuring employees received better guidance on handling complaints and interacting with passengers fairly.